Alright, I'm going to attempt to explain each suspension component with a little bit more detail than what the game provides you. I'm also going to try and break down each component by where it affects the performance in a corner. I'm going to break a corner down into 3 sections. The entry, meaning braking and turn in, mid corner, and then exit. Let's start with ride height. So this affects your overall performance, your overall cornering performance in all 3 sections. A lower ride height generally gives you better performance. However, you don't want to be cornering on the bump stops. If you hit the bump stop, it drastically increases the suspension stiffness and can cause a sudden understeer mid-corner. And so you want to choose a ride height that is sufficient enough for your spring rate. Now your spring rate. This mostly affects entry cornering performance, so braking and turn in. A stiffer spring rate in the front will make your car more stable on while braking and turning in. However, it can also cause you to understeer if your spring rate is too stiff. However, there's an added benefit of having a stiffer spring rate in the front. That is, you can run a brake bias that is more rearward, giving you better braking performance. However, like I said, if your spring rate is too stiff, you may have really good straight line braking, but you won't have very good turn-in performance on the brakes. Anti-roll, this affects the car mid-corner mostly. Let's see, a weaker anti-roll bar gives you more front grip in basic terms, and a stronger anti-roll bar gives you less front grip in basic terms, mid-corner. Of course, there's a little bit more detail that I'm skimming over for the sake of not wanting to explain physics too much. Just keep in mind that a weaker anti-roll bar will give you better front-end performance mid-corner. However, it will also make your car a little bit more unstable. Camber angle. This is a static camber angle. Basically, when a car is cornering, the tire will roll under the rim, and if you have the right amount of static camber, the tire will roll onto its maximum contact patch area onto the road. Toe angle, and this affects your overall performance everywhere. I guess I'll break it down into 3 sections. Entry, a higher camber angle gives you a disadvantage on the brakes, but a better mid-corner performance, and also a little bit of a disadvantage on the exit. But generally on exits you're straightening out, so it doesn't matter that much. Toe angle, this is mostly affects your performance at speed, and generally affects your entry to a turn for front toe. If the entire stage is generally slow, you can run toe out so that you have better steering response. However, if a stage is faster overall, you may benefit more from having toe in to decrease the steering response. And the reason why you might want to decrease steering response is so that every little twitch doesn't cause the car to, every little twitch in the steering wheel doesn't cause the car to dart off the road and send you into the trees. However, here on Monte Carlo, I like to run toe out because it's slow enough to not get too squirrely at speed. All right, front damping. Bump damping, this affects steering response. Basically, if you turn the wheel, it affects how quickly the car will respond to your input. And so if you have a firmer front damper or front bump damper, it will respond quicker to your steering input, meaning when you turn the wheel, the car will turn. It'll turn when you turn it, which is kind of self-explanatory. However, if you run a bump damper that is too soft, there will be a delay in your steering, which will feel a little bit squishy or wobbly in the front. However, you can gain a little bit of a benefit from having a soft bump damper, and that is since there's a delay in your steering, every little input is not as drastic, so it's not as twitchy in the front when you turn in. Whereas if you have a firm front damper, it'll be twitchy. So if let's say you get into a slide and you counter steer, it'll suddenly regain grip pretty quickly with your counter steer with a firm bump damper. And with the softer bump damper, you have a little bit more of a leeway with your counter steering inputs. This also affects your entry performance. Keeps you stable. A firmer bump damper keeps you stable while on the brakes and turning in. However, it can reduce mid-corner performance. However, you can offset a firm bump damper with a soft spring rate and anti-roll bar. Let's skip to Rebound, front Rebound. This affects your exiting corner performance. Basically, when the front end unloads its tension, it changes the dynamic loading of the tires to the rear end when you accelerate. And so if you run a softer Rebound in the front, the weight or the loading will transfer to the rear faster, and so that can cause push on throttle. And so you want to select a Rebound that gives you the right amount of stability on throttle, because if you have too much Rebound in the front, it can get really loose while exiting. And however, if you have too soft a Rebound, it can get really tight, or it can push on exit. Let's go back to fast bump. This doesn't really have any real specific corner performance. This is purely for jumps and landing those jumps. And a firmer fast bump damping will slow the impact of the car when it hits the bump stops. If you go off a jump and you land from any significant height, you're going to hit the bump stops. And so you want to reduce that force, because what happens is the force transfers into the chassis, and the whole chassis basically performs like a spring. And so when you hit the bump stops with the force of a hard landing, the whole chassis will spring back, causing it to bounce up with the rebound of the suspension. So you want to reduce that hard landing force. And the fast bump threshold is the speed, I think it says. The speed at which it activates, the fast bump activates. That's pretty self-explanatory. Already went over that. Fast rebound, again, this is for landing jumps. Basically, after the car impacts the bump stops and all the force transfers through the chassis, it's going to unload the force that you inputted in, and so you want to reduce that spring back from that force so that your car doesn't bounce up. And what happens is, if it bounces up and you have to corner after you land a jump, you're going to have no grip to turn, and you're going to go straight off into the trees. And this, again, is pretty self-explanatory. It's the speed at which the fast rebound activates. All right, suspension rear, ride height. Again, this is just overall cornering performance in entry, mid corner, and exit. However, with the rear ride height, depending on the racing simulation, you want to run with a little bit of rake, which rake is the angle of the under tray. And so you want to have the front end lower than the rear end, so that it creates a low pressure under the under tray, or more of a low pressure under the under tray, giving you more downforce. Rear spring rate. This affects your mid corner and corner exit. A firmer spring rate in the rear will give you more oversteer mid corner and corner exit. A softer will cause the car to be either more stable or push mid corner and exit. You don't want to run too soft of a rear spring rate, otherwise it will become really unstable on high speed weight transfer, like not necessarily high vehicle speed, but a lateral load speed. So if you're turning left and then you suddenly change direction to a right turn, the weight will transfer really fast across from the left to the right, and or from the right to the left actually. If the spring rate is too soft, excuse me, if the spring rate is too soft, the car will be unstable in those situations. Excuse me. Anti-roll bar. This mostly affects mid-corner and exit. And for anti-roll bar in the rear, a stronger anti-roll bar in the rear will give you a little bit more oversteer. Weaker will give you more stability or understeer. Again, this similar to the spring rate. You don't want to run too weak, otherwise in fast weight transfer situations the car will be unstable. Camber angle, I already explained on the front end. Now, rear toe angle is actually pretty important. This affects cornering performance around the whole corner in all three sections. However, it mostly affects your performance at speed and cornering at speed. Toe in will keep the rear end in alignment with the front end around either over through a high-speed straight that's bumpy, or maybe a slight turn in the high-speed section. And what you want the car to do is to recenter itself automatically. If the stage is a little bit slower, you can run a little less bumpy. Also, you can run less toe angle. Also, rear toe angle is beneficial to have on low grip situations, so that the car recenters itself over differing grip levels. If you're cornering through a corner over ice and then dry pavement and then ice again, the car will stay more stable in that situation. All right, rear damping, bump damping. This affects your car mid-corner and exit. Basically, this affects the response of the rear end loading from lateral loads. And if you run a firmer rear bump damper, the car will be a little bit more twitchy around a turn and around an exit. And also around high-speed sections, it'll be a little bit twitchy. It'll lose grip in the rear quicker. If you run a softer bump damper, it won't lose grip as fast. So essentially, the front end will lose grip before the rear end, keeping the car stable. And so you want to find a balance so that you get the cornering performance you want while maintaining stability in high-speed and cornering situations. However, if you run a bump damping that's too soft, again, it will cause the car to be unstable in high-speed or fast weight transfer situations. I'm going to skip to rebound. Rear rebound. This affects mostly has the most effect while entering a turn on the brakes. Basically, when you go on the brakes, the car end will dive and the rear end will lift, and this slows that lifting process, and in a way restricts it so that you have more rear grip on the brakes, giving you better braking power with a rear brake bias, a rearward brake bias. Fast bump, again, this is for jumps. As I explained with the front fast bump. However, for stability when landing those or impacting the far end of the jump, or the landing of the jump, if you have a little bit softer fast bump, that will cause the car to stabilize on landing, because the front end again will lose grip on landing before the rear end. So it'll give you time to react to how the car is going to, whatever the car is going to do on landing. Sometimes you land with a bad angle and the car will generally center itself on landing. Let's see, fast bump threshold. This again is the speed at which a fast bump activates. It's pretty self-explanatory. Fast bump or fast rebound. Again, this is for landing jumps. You don't want the car to spring up off the ground. If the rear end springs off the ground, you'll lose rear grip on landing if this is too soft. And generally, you can just run maximum damping. However, I like to run personally. I like to run a little bit more rebound in the rear. Rebound dampening in the rear for fast bump, and then the front, so that the front end regains grip sooner, or the front end springs up, I should say, sooner than the rear end, giving you that centering effect from landing. And then fast rebound. This again is pretty self-explanatory. It's the speed at which the fast rebound activates. There's no real specific cornering section that this affects, or this. And I think that's it. I may go over a little bit more. Well, let's go back to front damping. One of the benefits of having a firmer bump damping in the front is that it stabilizes the car on the brakes. So generally, when you start to lose control, you want to shed as much speed as possible, so that one, you can regain grip. You have a wider range of how do you explain it? It's easier to regain grip at slower speeds than at higher speeds, is what I'm trying to say. And so you want to bleed off as much speed when you lose control. And if your car is unstable on the brakes, you're just going to put yourself in a worse situation when you lose control. And getting on throttle, sure, like the old saying, when in doubt, flat out, that can stabilize your car depending on your suspension setting. However, it means that if you do lose control, you're going to lose control a lot faster than if you got on the brakes, which is a gamble. If you want to roll that dice, that's up to you. What else did I miss? I think that's it for suspension. I'm going to load this in case I made some changes I didn't want to make, and then do a test run.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Into right 5 don't cut, and left 5, into right 4, into left 2 tightens. 150. left 1 opens 100. Right 5, and left 6, into right 5, and left 5 long times 4, and right 2, right 1, left 3 150 through dip. Keep left over crest, keep right over crest, right 6 long times 5, and continues 80, left 5 long over crest 60, and left. Into right 3 long, opens 100, caution left 5 long over crest by camber, right 6, and caution left 5 half long, tightens immediate head right, 80, right 5 half long, left 4, and right 4 half long, 80 over crest, left 4 long 100, keep right over crest, 80, right 6 long, 60, caution left 4 half long, slippy, and right 5 half long, over crest, left 4, and caution right 6 continues 100, don't cut, into hairpin left, 100, left 6 long, and right 4, more ice patches from here, into left 5 half long, don't cut, and right 4 long, into caution left 6 don't cut crest, into right 3 times 2, left 4 long don't cut, right 3 times 2 80 over crest, left 6 continues 100 over crest, 80, caution left 4 long into hairpin right, left 6, and right 4 long, and right 5, left 6, into right 6 half long over crest 80, crest left 1 half long 100, full ice from here, left 6 over crest 60, right 5 times 4 don't cut, into left 6, into right 6, into left 5 60, left 4 long over crest continues 80, and left. 60, right 5 long times over crest and continues.
Well, that was dumb. Completely missed the call.
Into left 5 30. Caution headed right. 100. Keep mid over crest. Left 6 60. Left 4 long. Right 5 keep in, left 6 half long keep in 100. Caution right 6 long through dip, braking head left. 100 up. Left 6 half long crest. And caution left 6, right 5 tight into head right. 60. Left 6 60. Right 6 long into left 6, and right 3 long crest, right 6 80, left 5 long keep in, and right 4 long 80 over crest, left 4 long crest, into right 4 times to 3, into left 4 long keep in, right 5 long, left 5 half long crest, right 6 long, left 5 half long 60, turn right 1 to finish.
Oh, had a little bit of an off there, but the car is pretty stable, at least as stable as I like. It's not particularly quick in terms of online competitiveness. However, it when you don't miss your braking points, it allows you to finish a stage a lot easier, I think, anyway. Alright, that's it.